from the Psych Hub Podcast Network.
Hi, I'm Marjorie Morrison.
And this is Patrick Kennedy.
And you are listening to the Psych Hub Podcast, The Future of Mental Health.
So today we're really fortunate. We have one of my real heroes, a modern day astronaut who is going to take us into inner space instead of outer space to explore the neurons and the galaxies in our brains that have yet to be discovered. But for people like Matt State, who've dedicated their lives to understanding how the brain works, he's a hero for all of us who have suffered from a brain illness and are looking for answers. I am so thrilled to have him give us a perspective of how the science can unlock our understanding and future therapies for these illnesses, because we only get those therapies by better understanding the nature of these illnesses. Matt's a brilliant scientist, neurogeneticist, was at Yale, now at UCSF, focuses on kids. He's just the best all the way around, and I'm so happy Matt is with us today.
All right. I have no doubt you're going to enjoy this show.
Matt, you're a real hero of mine. You, of the country, had folks like you out there and could see what you do on a day-to-day basis to advance understanding of the brain in the most fundamental ways that are going to transform all of our families' lives by the discoveries that are made because of your labs. You'd be more famous than all the superstar athletes out there. You're a total rock star. I just want to say it because we do not elevate to kind of hero status. The people are doing the kind of research that literally transforms lives. And so for our listeners, let me just say I'm just such a champ because of what you do, because I've seen it up close. When I was on the NIH Appropriations Committee, unlike most citizens, I got a chance to get briefed from folks like you, people like Husseini Manji, John Crystal at Yale, and Steve Hyman, our good friend, who's now head of Eli Broad. I've had such a front row seat. I am so excited. Like, I think back when my uncle inspired a generation to go to outer space and those astronauts and thinking about the Apollo program, Mercury program. Today, we need that kind of enthusiasm for the race to inner space. And
I couldn't agree more.
So I want to just ask you, because everyone blames these illnesses like these people have lack of will and lack of morals, and so it's so important on an extra value. It's not just the science; it's how that understanding the molecular genetic level can blast stigma apart in a way that all of our anti-stigma campaigns can't hope to ever do.
Wow, that was awesome. But seriously, like what you said actually is, I am such a firm believer in this notion that there are multiple mental health crises right now. At multiple, our system is broken, no question. We're confronting some of the biggest societal challenges out there that intersect with mental illness and mental health, from poverty to homelessness to substance abuse, etc. And in my view, we also have this simultaneous crisis in our understanding. And the crisis in understanding is that even among scientists, we're catching up, but we're decades behind the rest of medicine in terms of understanding the origin of these illnesses that plague people. And then there's this related, I think, crisis of understanding in the general public. And that connection that you just made, I completely believe, which is that a huge challenge around stigma are these mysteries, are the fact that this lack of understanding drives prejudice and blame and shame. And so a lot of the motivation, as I said, I came out as a clinician and then went back and learned how to do the science stuff. And a lot of that drive really is aimed at that my feeling is that for not all of mental health, because it's an incredibly huge field, but there's a huge part of what we do, particularly for the kinds of kids that I see, where the more that psychiatry is in the center of medicine, is a part of the medical enterprise, and the more that people understand that, the more that stigma is going to disappear. And as long as, if your kid, God forbid, has cancer, and you walk into a hospital and it's a gleaming monument to modern medicine, and you know where to go, and people have answers for you, even if it's not 100%, but they have things they can explain to you a lot of what's going on and why you're getting the treatments that you're getting. You're accorded, a special place in society. You don't get that when you have a kid who has mental health problems. You're blamed. It's like the mom did a bad thing, or what's wrong with that kid, or they're poorly behaved. And often, even on the, physical plant side, you're not going to gleaming monuments to modern medicine. You're going to that, whatever, the building 3 blocks away that the health system could afford to relegate to mental health. So all of these messages about mental health that separate it from medicine are to our disadvantage. Now, it's complex, as you described, right? There's this huge spectrum of illness, and it doesn't make sense. It's just like, it's not a great analogy, but you talk about blood pressure, right? So, if someone has very high blood pressure and they come into the emergency room, there's a thought like, oh, well, this could be that there's a very strong genetic load. It could be partly lifestyle. It's almost always some interaction of a predisposition with what's going on in the environment. In a more complex way, that is our story for pretty much every common psychiatric disorder, right? So there's evidence that you come in with a certain biological set of predispositions, but genes are not fate. You're not, determined at birth that this is going to be the path that you take. But just like people have other complex illnesses, there are people who are more vulnerable, there are people who are less vulnerable, and there are ways that the world around us can make it worse, and there are ways that the world around us can make us better. For some reason, that complexity is very difficult for people to absorb it when it comes to behavior, right? When it comes to emotion and social interaction, et cetera. So there we have some big challenges in making people feel comfortable and understand where mental health and mental illness intersects with modern medicine and how that can work to fight stigma. And there's a broader discussion about how to promote wellness and mental health in society. So in any case, I do think it's partly why, people sometimes when I'm a child psychiatrist say, well, how can you be a geneticist? You see the complexity of the world and you see families who are, struggling with early childhood trauma and all of the things that can lead to bad outcomes. How can you hide yourself away in a laboratory and look for genes? And my answer is, first of all, thank goodness I don't have to. I live on both sides of that divide. I work, in public mental health in the clinic, but there is a contribution of science that goes beyond just the wonder of discovery. I think it has tremendous power to change not only what we can do for patients, but how society feels about these conditions. Now, I'm just going to pivot real quick. What you said is incredibly important as well. Like, what have we learned from genes? So genes can be incredibly helpful in trying to sort out how the most complex organ in the human body, the brain, develops, how it can go awry, how it can lead to serious problems. And genes, in some respect, are sort of the simplest starting point for us to understand biology. But I said there are 3 billion bits of information in the human genome. There are 100 billion neurons, right? So the complexity, honestly, of the genome is less than trying to dive into the brain. So it's a way for us to start to get some grasp. That's why I decided to be a geneticist, some grasp on what's happening. So it's taught us many things. And one of the things that it's taught us, Patrick, is that genes do not read the DSM, right? Like this notion that there's going to be a gene that leads, just to autism, blown up, right? One of the first things that we discovered, we looked in kids with autism, we started to discover genes like lo and behold, and they're strongly related to risk in autism. And then we found them in kids with epilepsy, and then the same kinds of changes. And then we found them in people who were fine for 19 years or ostensibly fine for 19 years and then end up having schizophrenia. There were kids who had these genes who had grown up, they were adults, they had minor language problems. So it shows us that there's this complex interplay between what you bring into the world and then what happens. And so they're important clues, but I always stress for parents, particularly if they've gotten results from a genetic test, that this is not fate. The brain is tremendously plastic. We rely on that for all of our treatments in psychiatry. It's an avenue for us to understand at a level that we've never understood before. And hopefully it's going to open the doors to allowing us to harness some of the things that already help make people better, help buffer people against adverse childhood experiences, et cetera. So yes, the brain doesn't read the DSM, genes don't read the DSM, the nature doesn't carve at the joints. And you'd be surprised at how much the field kind of thought that would be the case. And then discovery has completely blown that up.
Explain the systems approach. Like with NASA, they had systems analysis. So talk about how the brain and approaching psychiatric disorders, its genome, proteome, metabolome, phenome. Can you explain how you...
How do you know all those things?
That's why
I'm such a geek.
He's probably Googling it.
No. So tell us, Matt.
This is like literally the best set of questions I've ever. This is like what I live and breathe. So first, just asking the question, like, can science help us attack stigma? It's like every day I wake up thinking, science is going to be the driving force. It's going to be better than education programs. It's going to be better than anything else that we can do. And maybe I'm self-deluding because it's what I do. But I really do believe that. And then, what happened immediately, we, as I said, we were one of the first labs to discover these genes in kids who had contributed to something called the Simon Simplex Collection. So they were the kinds of kids that you would see in any autism clinic around the country. And there were like 3 labs that were racing to do this, collaborating and racing each other. And we were all about to hit the finish line together. So we got, one of those first genes. And so we knew that we had it, and we knew that we and these other labs were solving the problem, right? The technology had come together. We knew there's a specific strategy that was going to be successful. And I was like super excited about this. And I had this postdoc and we had this gene. It was a great gene. We're like, it's like 10 years of waiting for this. And so I went running down the hall. I was at Yale at the time, and there was an expert on my gene down the hall, right? So it's like, oh my God, like we're going to go from finding this gene to figuring out something like brand new about treatment. And he was, old and older. That's like probably my age, but anyway, he seemed old at the time. We walked in and like, we have this autism gene and it's what you study and, will you do X, Y, and Z? And like, he was just kind of sitting there. Was like, okay, yeah, I'm happy to do this. Like, how can you not be excited? And he said, okay, now that you found the gene, essentially, you just need to tell us when in the brain it's having its activity, where in the brain it's having its activity. Because if you don't understand it in the system in which it's working, I can't tell you anything. Because if I do this with it in this kind of cell, I'm going to get one answer. If I do this with it in another kind of cell, I'm going to get another answer. If I do it early in development, I'm going to get a different answer. It sounds like like an obvious thing, but I was shocked as a child psychiatrist that the perspective that you're describing, Patrick, was like, I was so busy trying to find a gene that like all the space between the gene and what we were seeing in clinic had collapsed and disappeared for me. And so in that moment, exactly what you described, like came rushing back. There are all of these levels. Genes don't like turn on and give you a behavior, right? Genes make RNA. RNA makes protein. The proteins are regulated by a variety of processes that we called, transcriptional regulation, there are other things. Essentially, they're conductors to the orchestra in the genome that turn genes on and turn them off in this highly, highly specific way that allows, a brain cell to be a brain cell. And then that has to fit into the context of other brain cells, and those create circuits. And those circuits underlie behavior. So suddenly it was like, oh my God, I'm over here with a gene. And like behavior is across like this enormous divide. And so my lab pivoted. And what we did from that moment on, Patrick, was to try to say, what do the genes tell us about the systems in which they live? And can we pull on this thread to begin to understand? System is really a way of of talking about the sort of complex machine that's the brain and what that context is. And thank God I live when I do, because, we didn't have the technology when I started to find genes, then we got it. And then there was all this technology coming along at the same time that allowed us to start to put that in context.
Let me ask you to explain why we're at such a precious moment in terms of supercomputing capacity to unlock the most important computer of all our brains, like global major data sets, integrating all this very complex systems that you just described. Explain to the public right now, like, why this is such an exciting time for neuroscientists like you.
It is truly an amazing time. So you've started already to answer your question, which is this is the most complex thing in the human body. It is built on a foundation of genes, but that 3 billion, part data set is the simplest part of the whole problem. And every question you ask beyond that has more and more data. And so when you start pulling on this thread and say, what does this gene do? When does it do it across development? How does that change across development? Even if you just start with one gene, the amount of data to place that in the context of the human brain is enormous. And what's happened really over the time that I've been in the field, which has been amazing, is this confluence of a social movement, public advocacy driven by parents in my world that said, you cannot work alone. You have to share data because you're never going to solve this problem without sharing data. That pushed a complete culture shift in science, again, right around the time that we started to have these tools that said, you have to contribute to things that are bigger than yourself. And then we got the ability to measure all these things. So these data sets over the past decade have been growing and growing and growing. But then the third challenge is when I started out, you asked, how do you read the DNA? So a study, when I started out, we'd look at 200 spots in the genome out of 3 billion, try to infer what the hell was going on. And that would take us, 10 days to run 5 people in a family, right? So that was our magnifying glass on biology. And, and then you think about the terabytes of data just about genomics, but then you add, okay, well, I want to understand how the genes relate to proteins, which is a space we're in right now. And each gene can make multiple proteins. And in each cell, it may be different. So we are talking about petabytes of data. And so thank God, everyone is forced to share now.
Wow.
So these are resources you cannot hold on to yourself. That creates a foundation for the entire scientific field for supercomputing, artificial intelligence, or a brilliant postdoc in your lab who has a great idea that you think is stupid to go and dive into this data and to prove people like me wrong. And honestly, every major discovery in my lab has been that last point. Like some brilliant kid in my lab who knew how to use a computer and could dive into massive amounts of data, prove that the way that I thought that this was going to go was not the way that it was going to go. And that's what's happening kind of across the universe right now.
Explain the universe. Explain, because really we need China. We need China, right, to be part of this. We need Europe to be part of this. We need Australia. We need the globe to join together in huge cohorts of research. The United States, very myopic. It's just about treatment in the United States. This is a challenge that the world faces. This could be an opportunity for the world to come together. Explain how the kind of data we need to decode the brain is going to need to have everybody participating in the science.
Yeah. Again, amen. I mean, it's at every level. One of the things that we learned is that for many types of genetic studies, this kind of working on your own in your laboratory was just so underpowered. It was ridiculous. And even working across a country is not, for many of these things. And so a lot of what's happened, in genetics, including, by the way, in my field in particular, in childhood genetics, there was this, as I said, this huge push of parent groups in the United States that pushed for data sharing, changed the culture, and really pushed for international consortia. And this was picked up early by the genomics field. So while, it has this reputation of being cutthroat and in science, the reality is that in many ways, it's really led the way in saying we all need to be able to look at all of the data. It needs to be shared immediately. This needs to be international. There's no question that it needs to be international. And that started to build. Now, even in that area where we're ahead of other parts of science, where they continue, as you say, to have sort of a myopic focus, and they'll say, oh, my lab or my consortium is the only one that knows how to do this kind of scan. Like, people used to say that in genetics too, and then it was clear that that's just not the case. You can share, it doesn't destroy the field, et cetera. But in genetics, even we've made a lot of progress, but still everything that you've said is important. Like most of what we know about genetics right now is on European Caucasian populations. And we know that particularly for genetics, that if you don't understand diversity from a scientific standpoint, from a genetic standpoint, the results that we get literally can be useless. When we try to use a genetic profile to predict what is, a diagnosis or to give us insight into biology, for many kinds of genetic studies, that is very, very constrained by the group that you're looking in. So you mentioned Steve Hyman, right? Steve is on this mission. He's always a decade ahead of everybody else, right? So he's been on a mission. It's like, we need to be in Africa. We need to be all over the place because, these are absolutely global problems. And the solution in the US maybe conceptually is going to be the same, but the rubber hitting the road, we need partnerships. And that's just on genetics. So it's true that the human race does not have the power in any individual country alone to solve the problems that we're talking about. This is the moonshot. This is beyond the moonshot to understand the complexity of the human brain. And we need the populations, we need the genius, we need the contribution of the entire globe. As you said, now, people I imagine listening to this can say, well, it's hard enough to get people together in the United States. How are you going to do that? It's happening. And if you don't call it out, it's not going to happen. So
let me ask you about your political science hat now on this.
Go.
Because if you look at the total burden of illness of neuropsychiatric disorders, it's a sea of red ink for not only the United States health system, every other health system in the world. It is an existential crisis, like our environment. Explain how, if we could figure out a way to shorten the gap in our understanding of how to intervene more effectively, even in understanding dementia, in understanding other kind of neuropsychiatric, we could dramatically reduce the cost, which if you replicated that cost across the world and across, health systems and economies, it would more than pay for itself for us to quadruple our down payment on good neuroscience now. But a global approach, if we could structure the ROI, it would be a no-brainer, so to speak, for every country in the world to say, we want to be part of this because it's going to have this material effect on the health and well-being of our populace. Like, explain how we can get this done. Like, cause I want to get the money to what you do. I want people like you to have all the money in the world.
I was going to say that, like, the brain is the most complex thing, and I found it easier than dealing with Washington and politics. So I left DC and I went to the lab to be a doctor, but I wish I had an answer to that question, because what you're saying is recapitulated in every part of the system. In my healthcare system, right? If we, in academic medical centers around the United States, we're always going hand in hand because we don't make any money in the healthcare system, and these are businesses. And so, you have to be at a place like UCSF that has this driving public mission in order for psychiatry, to be anywhere near an equal playing field with some of these other fields, right? And I think the same thing every day. It's like, man, if you could just monetize the benefit that we're going to provide by doing this, like you would, but it takes, as we're not great. Humans are not great. It's sort of the long-term perspective. And you need to, you need to be able to have that. And there are lots of day-to-day things that kind of push against that. And so that's replicated across the United States, as well as I. I mean, you fought, and had like the major victory in trying to get people to change their view of this, but chronic underinvestment. And then people say, oh my God, this problem is too big to solve. Well, if you haven't invested anything in 40 years in this, and you just let the problem grow and grow, and there's no foundational resource, like, it's no wonder that like these immediate solutions are, have people wondering why it's not going to work. It's sustained long-term investment with an understanding about what that's going to yield.
So explain, California had the social impact bond. Explain how because that could be a model for us more across the country, but even globally, how that works. They pick projects and try to get research down payment on things, and then pay for it with the savings accrued over time from reducing the burden of the illness. You explain a little bit about what's going on.
Yeah. So, I realize I've gone on a rant, and I shouldn't, in part because I do think that there are a variety I mean, certainly there are places, including in California, that have taken this on and done a variety of creative things.
I think around stem cells, they did some stuff out there.
Yeah. So stem cells, and it's just been announced now that major investment by our governor in child mental health and adult mental health in the city that I'm in. We have a mayor where she'll tell you that homelessness, mental health, and substance abuse is the number one priority. And that's fantastic. And still, I think it's why I just made that comment about the fact that I think kind of ironically, that creates sort of this game of expectation, particularly around, in the public sphere among politicians. And this is thinking about it in a different way, but their return on investment can be very poor, right? I mean, when you think locally what's happening, like I can tell you in San Francisco, there's no lack of interest in spending on or trying to address public health challenges in mental health. But the underlying system, as you know, is broken and very challenging. And there are many things that really need the whole of the country as opposed to a whole of government approach, right? I want to say something positive about it. I think the positive thing to say is that it's been a long road to get here. And I guess if there was one thing I would say about all of these initiatives is that somehow if we could get people to understand what you described about sort of around what the timeline is actually to make this better, and then I'll turn this podcast into a total downer if I start talking about, okay, well, these great initiatives, but here are 12 structural things that are going to stand in the way of that working in my lab, right? Like the chances that that's going to actually make it to the bench is not as high as it should be. And thank God there are people that are trying to make that work better. And like the stem cell initiative has been a positive model. And I think, as I said, Governor Newsom is coming out with a variety of creative things to try to switch that script. But I think ultimately, I don't know, I feel like we probably have a lot in common with people who are working on the climate crisis, who scream and scream like, do you not see that this is an existential threat? Do you not see that we're not talking 20 years from now, we're talking right now, the suffering right now, and still to galvanize the kind of societal change just in the United States that is going to be able to allow us to really take the lead on that is really tough. And thank God that there are people like you that are and working on this through your podcast, in addition to in Washington. And I think it all ties together from where you started.
The agenda is what we want. We don't need to know everything, because we can't even keep up with you on all the details. But all I need to know is to say to the public is Matt State and Steve Hyman and these folks, here's what they're saying. And you don't need to know all about plan A. Just know it's plan A. And I'm a pal. Yeah. I just need to know it's plan A. And I got all this best and brights and I'm going to invest in it. And if I got Mark Benioff from Salesforce in San Francisco says, this is an existential, I want a bond that's going to help make sure that people don't have to step over 15 bodies before they get to the front door of Salesforce because we have a strong public health system. I want that bond and I want this research bond and I want this. I tell you, the motivation will be there. The thing that depresses people is they don't have the roadmap articulated and mapped out. And I think that if we did that, we could really get wins. I mean, we'll get the criminal justice system. So explain on the criminal justice side, so much of that is mental health untreated. Kind of what you're doing, locally with UCSF to especially with kids and the foster care system. Jump on something else for a second.
No, absolutely. And I have to say, when you say that at the level that you're talking about, right, I'm failing in my job now. And because I do think that you're absolutely right. And when I say that, I have many different jobs, right? So one of my jobs is that I lead the Department of Psychiatry at UCSF. And thank goodness, I mean, I have a brain trust here that spends as much time thinking about studying and coming up with solutions in the area that you're talking about that I have spent and continue to spend and trying to figure out how to find genes and understand what they're doing in terms of brain development, figure out new treatments. But I still think as an enterprise, I mean, it's something actually we spend a lot of time talking about, including with some of the people that you've mentioned here, about we're failing in our communication. We're failing in getting the word out there.
But that's the system.
And I'm not 100% sure, we like right now we're trying to figure out sort of, how do we better engage? And honestly, I think even, we're just having this conversation more broadly at UCSF, right? Like this is, in some ways, people here think about this as like the best place you've never heard of. We're not Stanford, we're not Harvard, we're not, we're like UCSF below, University of San Francisco. It's like, there's actually one of the world's great medical institutions. But this question about how do you engage in these public debates? How do you do the science? And there's a real debate, right? Like we were just having this in a leadership retreat here, talking about sort of, some people were saying, the thing to do is be quietly amazing, right? Like just do the work, and other people are going to get it out there and it's going to build into this. And there were other people like, no, if you're not, we have one of our faculty members been out there really importantly on COVID as a real resource on Twitter, a chair of medicine, Bob Wachter. And so, he's done incredible good, but I think it is a struggle for us in science and in medicine sometimes in trying to figure out, and I do think in psychiatry as a field, and I'm not saying we're failing because we haven't been trying. I know tons of people are trying, but it is really a challenge. And it's why the stuff that you're, trying to figure out how we better partner to get the word out, to set an agenda, to galvanize support for this, because ultimately it is the answer. It particularly.
Well, I would just say, Matt, every social, governmental, environmental mission statement of a major corporation in America has to include how are you going to improve the system as a whole to advance this space. So I would say there is a great fertile ground for you to say they all ought to, with their business roundtables, their CEO roundtables around cancer, CEO roundtables around heart disease. Why not a CEO roundtable around the brain? They ought to have the Fortune 10, Fortune 100 be pumping money into not only advocacy to change this through NIH and globally, because they're all global businesses, but the political part of this. You guys need to give them the template. They're scrambling right now. They go, Patrick, what should we do? What should we do? I'm going to tell them, talk to Matt State. Matt can tell you what
and I'm
you
going to tell them
should
to
do.
talk to people in my department who spend their lives thinking about this, including, as I think you worked with Marina Toulouse-Shams when you were in Rhode Island, like one of the world's, most knowledgeable people on how to think about keeping adolescents on a good path, because that's like a pathway to all of the bad things that our society is facing, right? And incredibly important. And when I want to be careful because my department is listening to this, when I say that I'm failing, it's like, we have people in the department doing unbelievable work but screaming, this is what needs to happen in the criminal justice system. You were asking what we do at UCSF, right? We run, jail psychiatry. We run the probation reentry program, the psychological and psychiatric support services for the city. We're the largest provider of intensive case management for homeless, mentally ill, and justice involved folks in the city. Like we're definitely on the front lines, and those people are like, they've got the agenda. They're putting it out there. Doing that in an organized way as a field is still a challenge. And the kinds of things that you're talking about, it's why I love doing this and said yes. The minute that you asked about doing a podcast is like this kind of stuff. It's like these things need to come together in a way that academia often has not leveraged, right? Like the sort of this, just keep your head down, do good work in the lab and it's all going to work out. And we know that is not happening in mental health. And so we need to take that on. And you're right. We have substituted, as Tom Insel, has a wonderful new book that has some really stark data around this transition from a mental health system to a criminal justice system in terms of dealing with psychiatric illness in the United States, right? We all know what's happening, but it really is unbelievably stark that so much has shifted from, a health system to providing healthcare in a system of incarceration, which is, any more evidence of how broken the thing is that's what we've resorted to. And I often tell people, the largest providers of mental health care in individual facilities like Cook County Jail or whatever, right? Like, can you imagine a cardiologist like having any part of that sentence in what they do? So yeah, we have a lot of challenges, but I am going to say, and I don't really understand why, but it feels like we're starting to be at a tipping point in terms of public engagement on this. And the notion of, like CEO leaders at a roundtable doesn't sound that far away to me. And if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, okay, they'll probably do it around brain disorders, but no one's going to want to talk about depression. substance use, because, brain disorders are safe. Again, because they fit into our model of medicine, but we still blame people for being depressed or being anxious. But that has really started to shift. And I'm sure it's because of the contribution of people like you and the things that you're doing, organizations that are getting the word out on social media in a way that really feels like it's building momentum. And we've seen this with other social movements, that things that were totally unacceptable 5 minutes ago reach a tipping point and suddenly it's okay, or there's a majority of Americans who think that that's important. So I am optimistic, because I don't know how you feel about this, but it does
enormously
feel to me like
optimistic. So I'll just wrap this up by saying, when the space program was ending and the shuttles were going away, and they were interviewing people over the years who participated in the space program, and they said, from the janitor to the operator of the crane that moved the shuttle, they all said they felt they were part of something important. And I think the new frontier, as my uncle his administration was known, is really the last medical frontier, which is the brain. We're going to do it. I'm going to send you an event at the President Kennedy's library in the fall. And I am telling you, businesses like never before are saying, we want to get into neuroscience. We want to understand how to better treat. And plus, we want to do this because we want to get our employees to believe in us as employers. And this is an issue for them. And so it has to be an issue for us. I just think this thing's going to open up. And when it does, we have brilliant people like you, Matt. Your department, UCSF, is on the map. You've put them there in a big, big way. Your Sandy Weil and the Pritzkers, all that, the big supporters who've been fantastic in philanthropy. And by the way, there isn't a lot of philanthropy in this space next to cancer and everything. So I give full credit to everybody that gives money in this space. We want to call them out as our heroes as well. This is the chance to finally move all your great work forward. And I'm so grateful you've taken the time. Wanted to make it useful for all of our listeners to understand how important it is, the work that you do, and a little bit about that work. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you both so much. It's such a pleasure. And
Matt,
I hope that
this is the quietest I've been on any podcast, but the two of you were going so good that I just decided to let it go. But thank you for joining us, because this is so important. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'll say right back at you. Thank you.
As always, thank you for listening to our podcast.
If you enjoyed the show, drop us a review.
If you haven't already, subscribe to our podcast for the latest episodes.
For the latest insights, check us out at psychhub.com.